In this video, I'm going to show you my method for making a unique chessboard. It's got some weight to it. It uses clear epoxy resin as well as some stone pebbles that I got from the Dollar Tree. I'm Andrew Joseph Keith. I'm in the middle of a project of making my own custom chessboard, and I figured if I'm sculpting the chess pieces, I might as well make my own chessboard. So I'm building this on top of a floor sample that was 18 inches by 18 inches, but I think a piece of plywood would work great. This one is about 3/4 of an inch thick, but I think just half an inch is plenty because after we add the epoxy and the stones, it does get kind of heavy. To make things a little bit easier and to make especially placing the pebbles easier, I made a little jig that my wife suggested, which is basically just 2 pieces of wood with sections in between that divides it up into 8 squares, and that way when I pour the pebbles they'll stay in that little box area. And after I used this, it worked really good. There was still some little pebbles that I would kind of move around with a popsicle stick, but for the most part, it kept the pebbles where I wanted them, and it made setting up the pebbles a lot faster. So let me show you how I made this jig. I took 2 long strips of wood. These are about 1/4 of an inch or a centimeter by 2 inches. What is that, 4 centimeters or something like that, 4 or 5 centimeters. And so they're just strips of wood. And then I took some scrap sheet metal that I had in the yard, and I cut these into pieces that were the size of the chess squares that I wanted. You can buy these rulers that they have at the Dollar Tree. So this is just $1.25, used to be $1, but inflation, $1.25, one of these rulers, and then you can cut those up into the sections of however big you need the squares on your chessboard. But you will need these metal cutting snips, or whatever they call them. So if the chessboard's going to be 18 inches, each of the squares on the chessboard is 2.25 inches. So this is a large chessboard. And then I use a pair of metal shears to cut those. Now I happen to have a block of wood that I was using as a base for the sculptures that was that 2.25 inches thick. So I cut that in half with a handsaw. And then I used some wood glue and some clamps to glue this together. Glued that to either side of the jig at 18 inches apart so that that negative space inside was that 18 inches. Now, I'm using a file just to give a little bit of an indentation where I want to place each of those metal strips, and then I'm putting those metal strips in place. Now, I'd recommend using hot glue. This is what I was going to do, but then I realized that the glue sticks that I had were a different size than my glue gun. I didn't even know they made them in a different size, so I ended up having to use some wood glue mixed with some wood dust to put these in place. I just made do with what I had, but ideally, some hot glue I think would be the way to go. And then we're just gonna glue these in place. Then once that glue sets up, then we have our jig. I'm going through and marking out the grid system that I'll be using to do the squares. I'm just using a Sharpie. And then once I have this grid in place, I'm taking some masking tape, put that along the edge of the board. When I taped it, I don't think I got the masking tape to stick well enough to the edge, and there was some epoxy that seeped through. So take your time to really make sure that the masking tape really adheres well to the edge, because this will keep the epoxy from spilling over as you're doing this step of the process. Now I'm mixing some clear countertop epoxy resin. This one's a little bit older, but it's still holding up and it's working fine, but it does have a little bit of a yellowish tint to it. And for this first layer, that doesn't matter too much, but for the subsequent layers, I got a newer resin that is actually clear, and that way it'll look really nice and clean. And spread a thin layer onto the board. Then I'm taking a spoon and spooning in these pebbles, these white and black pebbles from the Dollar Tree, and it's actually a pretty good deal. I think it's 1.1 pounds of pebbles for just $1.25. Then I take those pebbles and I spoon them into the jig that I have on top of that wet epoxy resin. Now, something that I think I could have added to the jig was just little tacks or nails or something, just so that I could set it down on top of the epoxy resin without it getting resin all over the bottom and without it messing up the tape that I put around the edge. And there'd be just a little bit of space between the bottom of the jig and the board, and that way it doesn't constantly get epoxy resin on it. So that's something that I'll probably change in the future if I end up making more of these boards. And then I just alternated white and black, pouring in those stones with a spoon. And then I would use a popsicle stick to spread those out and make sure that they aligned with the edges that I was going for. And there you can see that. And I kept doing this along the board. And I just did half of the board at a time with resin. For this first step, you really just need enough resin to get the pebbles to stick. You don't need so much that it's a pool of resin on the bottom. I just did enough resin to get those pebbles to stick to the bottom. I figured out that because I didn't have those little stilts to keep the resin from getting on the bottom of the jig, I just put little pebbles in place so that I could set the jig on top of those pebbles so that it was above the level of the resin as I was setting everything in place. And that would keep it from collecting a bunch of resin on the bottom. And then I'm just trying to be as careful as I can, making sure that the white pebbles don't spill into the black areas and that the black pebbles don't spill into the white areas. And then on this last one, I removed the jig before I'd spread everything out. And then I realized that the jig really is very helpful for spreading things out and making sure that they're perfectly aligned. Even with the markings underneath where I could kind of see where the squares are supposed to be, it was a lot harder to spread it out in an accurate way quickly without that jig in place. So now you could go and continue adding layers of resin to build up that resin above the surface. But I thought, well, I don't want it to be so thick, so I'm going to remove some of the loose gravel on top that isn't epoxy to the bottom. And I realized that this would show some of the wood underneath, but I thought that that was fine, that would give it a interesting look where you could see that the pebbles were on top of a natural wood. If I was to go back, I probably would have just left the pebbles on top and done more epoxy, but you can decide how much pebbles you want and how thick you want the board. So to get rid of those extra pebbles that hadn't adhered to the bottom layer of epoxy, I just put it in a trash bag and shook off the pebbles. Now, I did the same thing on a smaller board because I was thinking, I have a stone grinder, and I was thinking that maybe it would be a good idea to grind the stones down so that everything's flat and then pour the epoxy resin on top. So I wanted to test out a little piece. Obviously, you don't want to test on an entire board and waste a lot, so I made this little board separate, and then with half of it, I just ground down the pebbles so that everything was flat. And then I poured a layer of that clear epoxy resin on top of that. But I found that when I did that, the black pebbles, wherever I had ground, even with the epoxy resin on top, they were like almost white in color anywhere that was ground off. I didn't like that look so much. So after that experiment, I decided that it was a better idea just to pour the epoxy resin over the entire thing without grinding it down. This is going to require a little bit more resin because you have to get over the peaks of any of the little pebbles that are sticking up. But I thought that it looked a lot better. So now I'm going to mix up some of that clear epoxy resin. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. And then just for this project, I did get a vacuum degasser. It was under $150, and that just helps take the bubbles out of the resin. So the vacuum kind of makes those bubbles expand and they come to the surface. So I did that with the resin before I poured it, and then I poured the resin over the surface and spread it out. Now you want to make sure that there's enough tape on the edge and also that everything is level. So the table that I was working on wasn't level, so the resin accumulated on one side and then was almost overspilling over the tape. So I put another layer of tape and then I turned the table, so it's a turntable, and at a certain point it was level, but then if you turn it, it becomes unlevel. Make sure that the surface that you're working on is level before you do this and that you have enough tape around the edge. Here's what it looked like after I removed the tape from the edge. I thought it was looking pretty good, but there was an issue where there were still some pebbles that were just sticking up a little bit above that surface of the resin. Here you can see what looks like bubbles, but it's just those pebbles that are sticking above that surface of the resin. So I could pour another bit of resin a little bit higher and try to cover all of those, but some of them were sticking up quite a bit. So what I did instead was I tested a little section on the prototype board, the little small board, and I sanded down with some 80 grit, so a pretty high grit sandpaper, and then I poured some of the clear resin epoxy on top to see if you could see any of the scratches of that sanding, and it was like invisible. So then I knew that if I sanded down the whole thing and then put another coat of resin on top of it, that you wouldn't be able to tell that I had sanded, and so that's exactly what I did. I went and sanded down the tops of those rocks, and then I also sanded the edges. I wanted to make sure that everything was sanded nice and flat and smooth. Now, once it's sanded, I kind of actually liked this milky look that it gave the chessboard, but I think it's cool to be able to see the pebbles. But if you like this look, if you like this kind of sanded look, then you could just end it here, a sanded finish. And there were certain spots on the black pieces where those pebbles were sanded off and there was that little white. And if I would have just left it, then there would be just little white specks in the middle of those black areas. And I didn't want that, so I went in with a Sharpie and just colored only on the stone part of those pebbles that were sticking above the surface that I had sanded down. And then once that was done, I put it on top of a rectangular piece of wood and on top of some cardboard so that I could pour that clear countertop epoxy resin over the entire thing, that it would go and then spill over the edges and I could clean up the edges. Now, if you're doing this, there's going to be drip marks on the bottom. So you can put some wax paste or something or some Vaseline on the bottom where you don't want the resin to stick, or you can just sand those drips off afterwards. If you are doing this layer over top of what you've already sanded, make sure that it's entirely clean. I found that there was a spot where maybe some oils from my hand were on top of the resin underneath and it kept the resin on top from sticking. And so it looked like a clean pool, but then there was an area where it just kind of dipped down. And so I had to try to clean that later on and it just wasn't as clean as I wanted it to be. So make sure that it's totally clean, that there's no oils. Even the oils from your hand can mess up the setting of the epoxy. Okay, there you have one chessboard made from stone and epoxy. I thought that this turned out really cool. If you're making a larger chessboard, I think it looks great. If you're doing a smaller chessboard, it might be hard to get these pebbles to look good, because then you have to be really careful to make sure that the pebbles aren't a little bit over to one side or the other, that they're really inside of those squares. Something that I thought might be cool to try in the future is maybe building out an actual grid system with wood, with maybe a piece of wood that's 1/4 inch thick and it's just like a square dowel, and then cutting it so that it goes in between all of the pieces. And then you wouldn't even need the jig. You could just pour the pebbles in between those little boxes with that wood grid in place. So that's something I might experiment in the future. I like the idea of doing that because then you could use a wood burner to burn in the numbers and letters of the board. And I think it might make it look just a little bit cooler. So I think I'm going to experiment with this some more. I think it turned out really cool. And I've seen custom homemade chessboards sell from $200 to $500 on Etsy. So I'm hoping that, you know, this one will be able to compare to some of those. I'm still working on the pieces. There was a hiccup. I ordered some of the wrong epoxy resin. I wanted to get some black resin, but I ordered another white resin. So I still need to work on finishing up those chess pieces. If you're interested in learning sculpture, then you can get my online sculpture courses over at proko.com/sculpture for my figure sculpting course and proko.com/portrait sculpt for my portrait sculpting course. Both of these courses have tons of information if you're interested in sculpting. And I also wanted to put in a teaser for an upcoming mini course that's going to be on sculpting the hands. I'm working on a hand sculpture right now. I'm really excited for that course. I think the hands are very expressive and really fun, and it's something that people struggle with, so I'm excited to address the issues that people have when they're sculpting the hands. So look out for that. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, stay creative, stay productive. I'll see you in the next one.